Coronavirus. Why are we so afraid? I'm sure we're all informed enough to answer this question. The government and health experts have all taught us why we should be afraid. But just in case you're not sure why you should be afraid, I'd like you to do something and ask something. Do something. First, do something. Go to the supermarket tomorrow and do this. Achoo! And then, when you've done this, say to the people with a puzzled expression, why are you so afraid? Why am I so afraid? Coronavirus is a killer, and you've just sneezed all over the bananas. Why am I so afraid? If you've got it, I've got it now. Why am I so afraid? Your snot just travelled over 2 meters in my direction. That is why I am afraid. Sneeze and ask people why they are afraid, and you're going to be given an answer in no uncertain terms. They are afraid of the virus, and since you might be spreading it, you should be afraid of what they're going to do to you. Now, whatever you do, please don't do that tomorrow. But I just was using that as an analogy to get us to think how we all know why we are afraid. Now, when Jesus and his disciples were on a boat journey, Jesus asked them the question, why are you so afraid? And when Jesus asked this question, they were facing just a pandemic threat as us. The waves around the disciples' boat were much closer than 2 meters, and the boat they were in was getting so swamped it looked like they were going to drown. It was as if a giant had sneezed right next to them, and this was a real threat to the disciples' life. Jesus got into the boat and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. He replied, you of little faith, why are you so afraid? Why were they afraid? Was Jesus blind? Was Jesus ignorant? Could Jesus not see that they were in the middle of a deadly storm? Why were they afraid? Did Jesus, their teacher, need teaching that a boat swamped with water always sinks? Why were they afraid? Did Jesus not understand the size of the massive threat? You know, to us, Jesus' words sound like stupidity. For when Jesus first spoke these words, why are you afraid? When Jesus first spoke those words, the wind was still raging, and the waves were still threatening the disciples' lives. You know, to us, Jesus' words seem like stupidity. That is until you understand who Jesus is. He replied, you of little faith, why are you so afraid? Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, what kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. You know, the storm may have been big, but Jesus gets up and proves that he was way bigger than the storm, more powerful than the wind, way greater than the waves. As God's Son, Jesus was bigger than both. You know, these threats may have been deadly, but Jesus was even bigger than the problem of death itself. And so, even in the face of such a deadly peril, the disciples and we can still trust him. Now, don't get me wrong, coronavirus is deadly. The threat of coronavirus is one we should all take seriously. As a nurse, I know that very well. We all have good reason to be afraid and to take sensible precautions. But though our fear and respect of coronavirus should be very great, our fear and respect for Jesus should be even greater. For as the Son of God, Jesus is bigger than coronavirus. Jesus is bigger than the threat of death itself. Even if the worst happens and coronavirus proves deadly, Jesus himself proved himself bigger than death. For in his life, Jesus died and rose to life again. And Jesus promised all who followed him the same. That is, the gift of eternal life after death. You know, I really pray that death won't happen to you. But the Bible gives us no promise that we will be spared from the troubles that affect the entire world. Coronavirus is going to affect us all in some way. Some big, some small. But when this happens, and as this happens, remember this: Jesus, as God's Son, is bigger than whatever may threaten you. Jesus, God's Son, is bigger than whatever may threaten you, bigger than the threat of death itself. If you are not a believer and you're listening to this, then your responsibility is to turn to Jesus in faith before that should occur, believing that Jesus is the Son of God and trusting his offer of forgiveness. And if you are a believer, you need to remember that Jesus is bigger than whatever may threaten you, bigger than the threat of death itself. And so whatever happens, he will be with you every step of the way. Jesus was with the disciples in the storm, just as he will be with you in the storm. Jesus was in control, even though things seem to be out of control to everybody else. For when it comes to wind, to waves, to coronavirus, when it comes to wind, to the waves, to coronavirus and death, Jesus is bigger than them all.